Hi everybody, I'm Dave Thomas, and this time I am building the Rocketarium Arcturus. This is a scale model of another sounding rocket, and I'm going to do things a little bit different with this rocket. So normally I put the whole rocket together and then finish it. In this case I'm going to pre-prime and partially finish the body tube and the fins ahead of time, and so they won't be painted, but they will be sanded and primed and filled and everything. And so things might look a little bit different in this video than some of my other ones if you watch those. So I'm going to unbox this thing and check for all the parts and then get started. The parts list is on the back of the instructions, and I'm not necessarily going to go in order here. So first of all, we have two body tubes, one of which is just slightly longer than the other. We've got the parachute here, and then Rocketarium often puts their sub-assemblies into individual kits. And so this is the motor mount. It's a 24mm motor mount, and then also the ejection baffle kit. All right, we've got a nose cone here, and then a set of 4 basswood fins, or basswood fins. Okay, 1/4-inch rubber shock cord, an applicator stick. This can be used for gluing later on. And then we've got another small bag here, and this contains the launch lugs as well as these little rectangles of balsa. These will be used for trim pieces on the fins later on. And then we've got an assortment here of decals. So we have a total of 5 sheets of black vinyl decals. Nope, I take that back. 5 sheets. And then there's also a small sheet of water slide decals here. These go onto the fin trim pieces. Okay, so it looks like we have everything we need, and I'll clear away most of this and we'll get started. Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to do a few of these things a little bit out of order so that I can pre-prepare, is that even a word, some of the parts. So, according to the instructions, the first 2 things we'll put together are these 2 sub-assemblies, the motor mount and the ejection baffle, and we will do that here in just a moment. Okay, but before we move on to marking the airframe, I'm going to go ahead and spray both body tubes with some filler primer. There are several brands of this. This is Krylon. I'm not advocating for them. It's just the one I happen to have. I know that Rust-Oleum makes one as well. But this not only prepares the surface for painting, but it fills in little imperfections and divots, including the spirals in your body tube. And the way this works is you spray it on, you let it dry, you sand most of it off again so that it's only filling in the low spots. Spray it again, sand it, spray it again if you need to. Okay, so usually between 2 and 3 applications, more if you have deeper spirals. So I'm going to be doing that off camera, and it can be drying while I'm then doing these other ones. The other thing I'm going to do is prepare the fins ahead of time. So if we jump up here to the fins, we're going to sand both sides and then round the edges of the leading edge here to give it some partial streamlining. Now, if you're not concerned about setting maximum altitude, things like that, you could even leave these square. I am going to paper these fins though, and it's kind of an experiment. You don't have to do that. If you just want to sand your fins and leave them at that, that's fine. But recently I've been seeing some threads on social media about using adhesive paper to paper fins. Now, I've papered fins using a glue-on method before, and I'm going to try this self-adhesive method on this kit as kind of an experiment for myself. This is the first step in the preparation of my body tubes. I have sprayed this with the filler primer, and what it's done now is it tends to move into the lower spots here, filling in the spirals, but also puts a layer on across here. Now with this particular brand, with the Krylon one, it's a very, very thin paint that comes out. And so it's got a very high solvent to solids content, and they recommend putting on several very light coats first, followed by 1 or 2 medium coats. And so once this has completely dried, it takes 30 to 60 minutes. Then I'm going to sand this and actually remove quite a bit of what's on the surface, leaving behind primer mainly in the low spots, especially in the spirals. This is one of the body tubes after I've primed and now sanded it. I did my initial sanding with 220 grit sandpaper, and if you have really deep spirals, which this does not, you might even use a heavier or a coarser sandpaper. And some people like to get all the way down to the body tube itself. I found this is probably enough, and I'm going to put another coat over this. Be warned, this stuff uses up sandpaper really awful. So just from doing this much, that's what my sandpaper looks like now. And this stuff does not come off very well. So I have a good supply of sandpaper on hand. This primer can be wet sanded, but I don't recommend doing it until you get to the final coat, because if you have exposed cardboard anywhere, the water from the wet sanding will get into that and cause it to expand and weaken. So I'm going to go ahead and sand the other body tube and put another coat of primer on that. Both tubes have been sanded now and also wiped off all the sanding dust. The whole reason I'm doing this is that if you're going to use a primer filler, it's a lot easier to do it at this stage than after the rocket's been completed. And the reason for that is once you've already got fins and launch lugs and all the other trim and doodads stuck on this, then you have to sand around those. And this takes quite a bit of effort just on blank tubes. If you have stuff stuck to them, you increase the risk of either knocking off those parts, or you don't get into the nooks and crannies as well as you might like. You could even, in some cases, pre-paint the tubes. Now, I take that with some caution. Any place that you're going to glue something on, you don't want paint on. And in fact, even on these guys, when we go to mark the tubes for the fins, I will sand off the regions where the fins are going to attach. So these are ready for their second coat, and I'll apply them in just the same way. So a couple of quick mist coats followed by heavier coats, let it dry, and then I'll give it some final sanding. Usually I've found that these come out pretty smooth without a lot of sanding after that second coat. Rocketarium model rocket kits all share one thing in common, and that's that they come with ejection baffles, so you don't have to use wadding or dog barf or something like that to protect your parachute. Most of their kits are based around BT60 body tubes, and so this one here is the most common. However, with the exception of their BT20, all of these go together pretty much the same way. The BT20 ejection baffle is a little bit different just because it's so narrow. And so these come with the kits, but you can also buy these separately to retrofit into an old kit or to install into a scratch-built kit of your own design. So very quickly here, we'll just open this up. And they're pretty basic, and they come with their own instructions. Alright, so we should have a coupler and then 2 baffle plates. And whichever design you get, the idea here is that the holes in the baffle are offset. Either this way, where you have some in the center and some around the circumference, or in some cases it may be half on one side and half on the other. They all work in the same way in that they prevent the direct flow of hot gases from the ejection charge to the parachute, and instead make those gases bounce around and become turbulent in here, giving them time to cool off before reaching the parachute. So we will start by putting this screw eye into the forward baffle plate here, and it has a little hole just for doing this. And here I'm going to use just a little bit of wood glue. White glue will also work here. Wood glue is a little bit stronger and it also dries faster. And so I'm just going to put a little dollop right on that hole. And now I'm going to screw down the screw eye just until I can't see that top thread anymore. I don't want to go past it. I don't want the blank shank here down in the wood. Okay, and then on the back side, it's pushed some of the glue through, and I'm just going to add a little bit more to that, and that'll just give us a really good strong anchor here. Okay, now I'm going to let that dry for a little bit, and while that is drying, I'm going to put a bead of glue here around the inside edge of one end of the coupler, doesn't matter which. Okay, I'm going to smooth that around with my finger. If you get any on the outside, like I got there, just go ahead and wipe that off, because we don't want to increase the circumference of the coupler. Alright, then we're going to take our other baffle plate and just push that into the glue. Alright, and I want to put that in so there's just a little bit of a lip of the coupler above the plate there. Okay. Alright, and now I'm going to let both of those pieces just sit still and dry for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'll come back to put everything back together. My glue has pretty much completely dried on both sections now, and so now I'm going to put another bead of glue in here. Like that. And I'm going to spread this a bit thinner, but also a bit wider than I did the previous one. And now what we're going to do is I'm going to put this in edgewise and then flip it up like that, and then I'm going to pull it forward a bit and give it just a little bit of a twist. Okay, and then for the most part doing this pulls the glue into the spaces here and forms a little fillet. There's a little blank space here, and I'm just going to take this excess glue on my finger here and just put that right along the edge. Alright, now I'm going to turn it back over to the other side, and I'm just going to put a small fillet of glue in here, because this will have to take the force of the ejection charge on it, so you do want it well reinforced. And again, I'm just going to take a finger here and smear that around. Okay, let's see if we can get a close-up here. Alright, so this will form a fillet in there, and on this side, simply pulling the plate forward helps form a fillet around here. Now this just needs to dry for about half an hour, and then it will be ready to go into your model rocket. So this is the BT-60 24mm motor mount. It fits both D and E black powder engines and can go up to an F-size composite engine. Inside the bag, we've got a multitude of parts here. This is the motor mount itself. This is a spacer tube that will be used to measure where the engine block goes. It's not actually part of the assembly. This is a spacer for the motors. So this will, when finished, will fit an E-sized Estes black powder motor or the equivalent size composite. If you're using the shorter 24mm motors like the Estes D or the Estes C11, this goes ahead of the motor to take up the space that would otherwise be occupied by an E motor. All right, we have two centering rings, an engine block or thrust ring, an engine hook sleeve, and this just helps keep the engine hook from rattling around, and then the engine hook itself. To start, we need to put a ring of glue inside the forward end at about 3/4 of an inch down. Okay, so what I'm going to do is take an applicator here and measure on my ruler where that's going to be. And I'm just going to put my thumb there as a quick measurement. And now I can just get some glue on my applicator here. Come back to where my thumb was. And if you need to, you can mark this. Okay, and so here's my motor mount tube. I'm going to stick my applicator into my thumb hits and just rotate that around a few times. So now we've got a ring of glue in there. And now stick the thrust ring in the aft end of the motor mount. And then the spacer tube here will go in, and now you just push this down until it's flush. And that will properly space where that thrust ring goes. You want to immediately take this back out in case there's some excess glue down there. And there's a thin film of glue. I got my glue a little bit deeper than 3/4 of an inch, but it's not a big deal because the thrust ring there has removed most of it. It's left a little film. Once it's dry, it will be just fine. Next, we need to measure from the aft end 3 3/4 inches or 95mm, whichever you prefer. All right, and at that point, we're going to put a little slit. So you can mark this with a pencil ahead of time if you want, or you can just hit it with your knife. And the idea is that this should be right above where that thrust ring is. Okay, so if you're hitting some resistance there, you might be just on the thrust ring, just bring it up a little bit. There we go. Okay, so you can see my knife coming through there. That just needs to be wide enough to put the forward hook part in. So the 90-degree angle there, not the fancier bent piece on the other end. So that's just going to pop right in there, like that. Okay, and so now, not only is the engine thrusting against that engine block or thrust ring, it's also thrusting against this. So it's just holding everything in there really, really nicely. Okay, now we need to make a few other marks. So we need to make a mark at 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters from the aft end. And you want to make this just slightly away from the engine clip so that it doesn't cover it later on. So I'm going to put that right here. And then we need another mark at 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters from the aft end. So that's going to be right here. Okay, we have two centering rings. One has a very small notch, one has a larger one. The end with the small notch is going to fit over the forward end like that. It'll just go over the forward part of the engine clip. Okay, and right now this is all being dry fit, no glue on it. The retainer ring here is just going to go over like this, and once that's dry, it just keeps this from moving back and forth like this, but still allows it to spring up to release the motor. And then the aft centering ring with the larger notch goes up to that 6mm mark. So once it's all glued together, it's going to look like this. Okay, so from here, you can just move that first ring out of the way a little bit. Take your glue and run a bead around that. And this can be fairly heavy. Okay, now I'm going to just move that forward. Okay, and I'm just going to look around, make sure that I'm reasonably straight there. If you're off a little bit, it's not going to be that big of a deal. But try and get it as close to perpendicular as you can so that all sides are equal. Okay, and then you can just take your finger and smooth that into a nice fillet. Try not to get glue on the outer part of the ring. And then come to the other side, and that excess glue you can put in as a fillet there. If you need a little extra, that's fine. Okay, so that's really well glued into place there. If you need to make a little fine adjustment, that's good. Okay. And now you're going to do the same thing for that engine hook sleeve. So it's normally going to be at that mark. So what I'm going to do is just pull it over the mark a little bit, not too much, because I don't want to get glue on my mark until after I've got it into place. Once again, we're going to add a bead of glue. Okay, now this one is not bearing any thrust, so we don't need a whole lot of really strong fillets or anything like that. I'm just going to move this ahead, put it where my mark was there, and just once more I'll go ahead and make a fillet out of it. Again, this is not really having a lot of stress on it. And even if you get a little glue up here, it doesn't come in contact with anything. Okay, so that part's fine. And then down here, I'm going to move that ring right to the edge of the tube. And then we're going to add another bead of glue here. Now, I don't want to get glue in the notch, so be a little bit careful there. Alright, now I'll move this up to where my mark was. Right there. Okay, and also at this point you want to make sure that this is straight, going through all the rings. Okay, and then once more, make a fillet here. And again, try not to get any down in that notch. Okay, and I'm going to straighten that all out. And if you want, you can put another fillet here on the aft end. Okay, once more trying to keep it out of that notch so that the retainer clip can spring back and forth easily. Okay, I'll just check and make sure that we're reasonably even all the way around. Okay, and at this point we will let this dry completely before inserting it into our rocket body tube. At this point, the primer on my body tubes is drying, my motor mount and my ejection baffle are drying, and so I'm going to go ahead and prepare the fins for papering. So the first thing is to go ahead and round the forward surfaces here. And I'm going to start with some 100 grit sandpaper. And I'm using a sanding tee. You can use a sanding block or just use your hand if you like. But having this hard surface gives you a more uniform edge. And what I'm doing is just moving up along that corner with a rounding motion as I go through that. And I can flip it over and do the same type of thing. Okay, and I'm just going to keep doing that back and forth. Okay, so that's pretty uniform there. And now I'm going to do the same thing by just sanding off the faces here, smoothing those out. Okay, and then I'm going to move up to 150 grit and just give it another light going over here. Okay, a little bit of paint on that, it's okay. Okay, and my other edges I'm just going to leave squared off here. If you really want maximum altitude, you can taper off the trailing edge and such. I typically don't because it gives you a stronger fin if it has the straight edges there. Okay, so I'm going to continue this with the other 3 fins off camera, and then I'll come back and start the papering. My fins are all sanded and shaped now, and you want to make sure and get all of the sanding dust off if you're going to paper the fins. Now if you don't want to paper the fins, you can just use them just like this. This would be the minimum fin treatment I would recommend, is give it a good sanding job, shape the forward edges here, and if that's as far as you want to go, great. Otherwise, you could also use sanding sealer on this and then resand after they've been sealed. Or, as I'm going to do here, I'm going to paper these using some self-adhesive label paper. Now this comes in lots of different sizes. This particular one has 2 big labels per sheet. And that should be far more than enough that I need. And what I'm going to do here is just try a couple of different layouts to see how much paper I'm going to need. So if I do them this way, okay, that uses 1/2 sheet, and then I would use the second half sheet on the other side. I don't think I can get them arranged such that I can actually just use 1/2 sheet. Okay, probably not. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is peel off one of these. And be careful if you still have glue and things on your fingers or other dirt. You want to keep your fingers as clean as possible for this. Alright, and now I'm going to go ahead and place these on. Okay, and since we've got the excess paper here, I'm just going to keep them fairly far apart so I have lots of excess paper. Okay, like that. And first I'm just going to squish all these in as much as I can. Okay, and we'll do the leading edges here in a little bit. I'm going to take the second label . Okay, now here's where we've got to be careful, is we don't want it to stick to its other side here immediately. We want to get it on the fins first. Alright, and now I'm going to kind of feel my way through this. I want to leave lots of excess between them. So I'm just going to cut around my fins here. Okay, so now we've got the fins broadly cut out. Okay, so now we can look down in there, see the edges of the fin. Alright, and up here on the leading edge, I'm going to bend it over like this so that the paper gets attached to the airfoil that we sanded into it. And I'm going to come over the other direction. Now when we cut this off, we will have a little bit of a gap in there, and we'll seal that up with a little bit of cyanoacrylate glue. Okay, but now I'm just going to go through and completely rub this together. Okay, I'm going to continue with the other ones off camera. I've finished pressing all of the labels on now, and I'm just going to trim off some more of the excess here. I'm not going to get really close yet. Before I do anything else, I'm going to let these set and let the adhesive do its job and adhere. I'm going to let these set for at least an hour before I do anything else. After letting the adhesive set for several hours here, now we're going to trim these away. And so you want to make sure you have a nice sharp blade in your hobby knife. And as before, I'm going to start out by just cutting inward a bit here. So I'm using my fingernail to feel where the paper actually is. Okay, and the reason it's ripping here is simply because it does have that space in between. Alright, and then once you can actually see what you're doing, you can come in trim some more off. Now here on the leading edge, we still want this to stick as much as possible. Alright, and what I'm going to do here in just a moment is we'll add some super glue to that. Okay, so at this point I've got all of the edges trimmed, and they are either flush with the wood or very close to it. Now I'm going to use some regular consistency super glue, so the relatively runny stuff. And I'm just going to apply this to the edges here. Just enough to wet them. Okay, and little curls of paper and such like that are not a big deal. We're just going to sand those off. And that's what this is doing. This will harden those paper edges, and then we can sand them so that they become completely flush with the wood. Now, I'm going to make one exception here on the root edge where I'm going to glue it on. I'm not going to add any super glue to that. Okay, but especially up here on the leading edge, we want to super glue the paper so that later we can sand them into the same shape as the airfoil we sanded into the wood already. Alright, so this needs to dry for at least 30 minutes. I would give it 60 before sanding it. And then I am going to do the other 3 fins off camera. I've made the second application of primer to the body tubes here and given it a light sanding. And if we take a look at them up close, you can see there's just a little bit of the tube spiral lines there. But I think this will get covered by the final paint, and so I'm going to just go ahead and call those done. If you're really concerned about tube spirals and such, you could sand this a bit heavier and then apply yet another coat of the primer. But just keep in mind, you're going to go through a lot of primer. Just to do these 2 tubes, I've used more than half a can of that primer. Now we can come back to the instructions and mark our tubes. So right now we just need the larger of the 2. I'm going to set the slightly smaller one aside. And we need to cut out the fin marking guide back here on page 3. And here you can use scissors, or you can use your hobby knife, whichever's handy. Now this guide is going to be used for both the fins and the launch lugs, and then later on we'll need it again for positioning the decals. So don't throw this away after we've marked the tube. Okay, I'm going to have a piece of tape ready here, and I'm just going to wrap this around and line up those tick marks there. Okay, so for the fins, we just want to mark the fine lines here, not the really heavy one. Okay, and we want to do the launch lug line as well. I'm going to mark that so I know it's not a fin. All right. Okay, and now you can take this to a door frame or other straight edge, and the fin lines really don't need to go past where we have the marks there. So if I compare one of my fins, okay, so it needs to come up a little bit past this, so I would take the fin line up to a little bit beyond where the edge of the fin will be. That gives us a way to align it. And then the launch lug line will go all the way up the length of the tube. Now, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to use this tube marking guide from Estes. Okay, so here I just need to find the right sized guide. Get all my tick marks made up here. There we go. Okay, just check and make sure that you've got them all in place. Now, before we put the other parts in, the motor mount and the ejection baffle, I'm going to go ahead and make a couple of measurements here. Okay, so this will be at step 6. We need to measure 10 inches from the base. Find my launch lug line. Okay, so when I go to the point of putting on the launch lugs, which I won't do right now, one will fit right here with its end flush to the aft end, and then the other will fit up here with its back end flush with this line. Now, the other thing to do before we put the fins on, and again I'm still a little bit ahead of where we need to be, but what we're going to need to do is roughen up and actually expose the cardboard where the fins are going to go. So I just put my fin on there as a quick reference. Okay, and here I would use some 100 grit sandpaper. And just go ahead and roughen this up all the way down. Now, if it's really heavy, you can also take your hobby knife here and use it as a scraper. So I'm holding it just a little beyond perpendicular. Okay, so now I've made a clear area that I can glue the fin to. And if you want, you can go put this back on your door frame or your tube marking guide and redraw the line in there. I'm going to continue this all the way around for the fins and then do the same thing for the launch lug. So I'll have a launch lug clear area here and another one up here at 10 inches. And I'm going to do this off camera. My body tube now has been marked for fins, and where the fins actually are going to go, the primer's been scraped away. It's now time to insert the motor mount. So this is going to go in the aft end, and here I'm just going to dry fit and make sure I don't have any surprises. Okay, it feels like this aft centering ring is just a little bit too wide. And so we can take some 100 grit sandpaper here and just give it some sanding around. There we go. Okay, so that's fitting nicely there. And so what we're going to do is we're going to put the glue on in 2 steps. And you can use either white or wood glue for this. So what I'm going to do here is measure with my applicator stick up to where that forward ring is. And then I'm going to back it off just a little bit here. Because what I want to do is put a ring of glue up inside the rocket that this will push through. So I'm just going to take my glue here, load the applicator, still keeping my thumbnail where my mark wants to be, and I'm going to stick this in and then up against the edge and just rotate it around. Okay, check to make sure it's even. You guys can't see that there, but it is. Okay, and now I'm going to put in the forward ring, right, but not all the way yet, so I'm going to leave this hanging out a bit. And now I'm going to put another bead of glue right inside the aft end. And you can rotate this around as needed. But this has to be fairly close to the edge so that the aft centering ring goes through it. Okay, you want a fairly heavy bead here, as this is going to anchor the motor mount. Okay, so now I'm pushing this in, and you may want to align your engine retainer clip how you like it. I'm going to put mine right about there. And now this should be flush with the aft end. So I'm just going to use my ruler here to finish pushing that in. Okay, so now, come on, focus. Come on, camera. There we go. Okay, so now that's pushed through. And then what we can do after this has set up for just a few minutes is we can add a fillet all the way around here to help strengthen the motor mount some more. So it's been a few minutes. Now I'm just going to add some more glue around the edge here on the inside. And it doesn't have to be a particularly heavy fillet, you just want it to fill in the cracks all the way around in that seam between the aft centering ring and the body tube there. Just like that. Now that the super glue has dried, we can come back and sand that. So here I'm going to use some medium grit sandpaper, and I'm going to start with the root edge here and then do the other two squared edges and then finish up with the leading edge. So for the root edge, I just need to make a couple of passes here. Okay. And you may notice that the paper kind of spreads out a little bit from the wood in some cases. That's actually not bad at all. It gives you an even bigger gluing surface when we go to attach the fins. I'm going to give this one just a few more strokes on the sandpaper. Okay, and then with the trailing edge here, and then the tip edge. And finally the leading edge. Now here on this particular fin, it's still got some paper sticking up here. I'm going to start with trimming that a little bit more with my hobby knife. Okay, and now I'm going to take some 220 grit sandpaper here and use that to blend the edge of the paper into the wood. Okay, and then now I can go around once more and do the same thing on these other edges. So there may be a little tiny bit of paper still sticking up here, and just gently blend that in. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and leave the rough sanded edge of my root edge here alone, because again that'll give me some more surface area for gluing. So I need to do this to the other three fins, and I will do that off camera and then come back. I have my fins ready to go, and so now I'm just going to take my wood glue here. You can use white glue for this if you have it. And I'm just going to put a thin bead on to begin with. Okay, we don't need a lot of glue at this point, because if you get too much it takes too long to dry and you're more likely to have a fin fall over. Okay, and now I'm going to stick this on my fin line here, and I'm going to pull it back off again and allow 30 to 60 seconds for the glue to become tacky. Once the glue is tacky, go ahead and put the fin back on. and then the aft end of the fin should be flush with the aft end of the rocket. And then go ahead and sight down the rocket, making sure that the fin is straight and perpendicular. And now let this dry for 10 to 15 minutes if you're using wood glue, 20 to 30 minutes if you are using white glue. After that, we'll proceed to go all the way around with each of the other fins, and I will do that off camera.